And we're live. Hello. Hi, everybody.
Everybody. I need to pause
Yeah, I
it.
need to pull up the chat here.
Hello, Alexa. Hello, Hagwood Mushrooms. Wait, Hagwood
Mushroom. Nice. That's interesting.
I feel like it goes over my head and I don't get it.
Yeah. Nice.
Oh, wait, I gotta mute this. Okay, there we go.
Is that you or me?
It was me. Well, now it's not.
It was me. I thought it was muted, but yeah.
Hello, Lizelle. Hello, Kremkin.
Hi. Hello. People, I know people trickle in, so everyone make sure you got your coffee. Make sure you're awake for this one.
I feel like you can already tell how Laura felt just based on that comment.
No, I mean, you know. But obviously, if you don't know, today we are talking about steering the craft.
I have an old copy.
And if you have the old copy, it's fine. I'm allowing it, Kevin. No, it's a lot of similar stuff. There was just some stuff updated for the 21st century. I'm going to use quotation marks around that. I don't know how reflective of the 21st century it really was, but we'll get into that. So,
Oh my God.
but yeah, this is a very popular book, especially for students, like in school. This is assigned a lot. I know a lot of you read this in college and stuff like that. It was like recommended to me like a million times by people. And so then Edward actually reached out to me too. He's like, hey, we should, do this. I was like, you know what? So many people have been telling me, even Kevin had told me. So I was like, all right, let's read it. So, but it is kind of short. So I also thought like I don't know, I got a lot of things to say about it, but we can also, if we run out, kind of get through those points quickly. I also kind of want to talk, since this is the last book club live chat for the year, I kind of wanted to just reflect a little bit on writing craft this year, what I've learned, what I still feel like I need to work on, and what you guys think as well, that kind of stuff. So, hi, Christian. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
So yeah, this is, and I'm just curious, like, Kevin, you read this first because you were assigned it in college, right?
It was.
And Edward, was the same for you?
No, it was recommended to me in college, but not assigned.
Okay. But before we get going, before we get started, we'll do some little introductions here. So if you guys don't know who I am, you're on my channel, so hello. I'm Laura, and this is the Let's Talk Craft Book Club. We were meeting like once a month to talk about a craft book. It kind of exhausted me this year to read so many. So next year, this is the last one for the year. So next year we're going to do one every 2 months. So our first one will be in January. I'll announce that book in November. So if you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure you do that. And I mostly write, well, I only write it right now, like young adult, contemporary, and speculative fiction. And I kind of chronicle that on my channel as well as review craft stuff. So, all right, Kevin, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Kevin. I'm Laura's brother. I help co-host the Let's Talk Craft Book Club. And I don't know, so I used to mainly write YA contemporary, but I'm kind of shifting that now to like YA, because my newest book's like a YA urban fantasy, and I think my next book might be also. I haven't decided yet. This is something me and Laura need to brainstorm off camera because she's going to help me with a project. So I mainly write YA with some adult stuff thrown in and all over the place amongst YA. So that's it. That's me. Edward.
Hi, I'm Edward from Edweird World. I am not Laura's brother. I write fantasy, and on my channel I talk about writing, and I lately have been doing a lot of fantasy book reviews, and I occasionally vlog, and I'm going to put in air quotes, I rant. I feel like I'm pretty gentle when it comes to ranting. I'm like, I can't believe this happened, and rant. So to call it that might be an exaggeration. That's me.
So both Kevin and Edward's channels are linked in the description, as well as information about the book and just other random things. So definitely check out the description. So, all right. Are we ready to get into the book? Okay, so here's what I want to do first. Okay, here's what I want to do first before I say anything. Because this book, like so many people have read it, so many people have recommended it, including both of you. I would like for you two both to kind of start out with like why this book? Like, what do you like about it? Why do you think so many people have read it? Why do you think it's helpful? Why do you think this is sort of like, you know, why is it so highly recommended? Why are so many people liking it? So,
Edward, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I could start. I can really only speak from my perspective, but really what it is kind of the sassiness on the page resonates with me. I do think that Le Guin has a very conversational style in this book. So even though a lot of it does feel a little bit like she maybe is doing this at you, at the same time, I respond pretty well to that. And I'm always like, I'm that student who always wants to like earn that kind of teacher's approval, so everyone's like, oh, they're so annoying and harsh, and I'm like, oh, but actually they like Leonard Cohen, so they're pretty cool, because that's what it takes to be cool in my eyes. So just that, I actually connect with it on that kind of level, even though I know, like I said, I realized for the first time kind of today that it's pretty dry. Additionally too, I can appreciate that she has a pretty no-nonsense approach to it all. In a way, it kind of reminds me of, gosh, I can't remember the name of the craft book, but it's E.B. White. Yeah, it's E.B. White, and I'm looking at it, but I still can't see the title. But it's just like very to the point and direct. It doesn't really meander. It just gets right to what it wants to say, and it says it directly, and it does not apologize for that. And in that way, I find it helpful.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you say that about her tone, because I do like that. Like, I find that most of the craft books, there's a clear voice from all of the people who are writing it, and I always either love the voice or hate it. Like, it just depends. And I tend to not mind when women are sassy in the craft books. That's my bias. But when men are doing it, I'm like, who are you? Why are you?
I'm kind of the same.
So like, I didn't mind that in here at all. I liked kind of her little like, it was almost to like a know-it-all tone, but she does know it all, right? Like she is a voice to listen to in terms of writing. She has the receipts, right, to back up what she's saying. So I would agree, and I appreciate that. And I do like that craft books always have like a distinct voice. They rarely read like textbooks, they're definitely like a clear voice, their voice in it. I guess it's because they're writers though. So that makes sense that they would convey their voice. So
I just want to agree that I definitely like, I like when women are like that, but when men are like that, I'm like, this guy's an a-hole.
Yeah. That's just like a bias I have, but yeah, like I did not like Truby's attitude. I did not like him. But there's something about like her I don't really mind. So, but what about you, Kev? What are some of your?
I mean, without giving away, how I feel about the book too early. A lot of my recommendation came from like this, I think, nostalgic view of it I had, that like it was really like the first craft book I read, and I felt like at the time it really informed the way I was writing, made me think about it in a way that I hadn't before, because it was the first one I read, so like it really stuck out to me. So without having read it again, I was like, oh yeah, this was like really informative when I read it years ago. Like now thinking back, I was in college a very long time ago, so like thinking back, I thought it was a great one to read.
Was that the consensus because you read it for a class, right?
Yes.
And was the consensus that people really liked it?
Yes, but knowing because the creative writing program in my college is not very big, so like I knew most of the people, like I had the same classes with them over and over again, and can definitively say this is the only craft book any of us had to read the entire time. So the fact that everyone loved it is not surprising.
Yes. That is definitely something that I've thought about with this in terms of like, because I always review the books later. So I always try to think about like, okay, who would benefit from this book? Like who would want to read it? And I definitely think people who have never read a craft book before, 100%. Though I would argue that the word craft is maybe a little not quite the word for the book, just because I've read so many craft books this year, that this is more, now she doesn't really call it a craft book either. She considers this a workbook. That's what she like calls it. I think even like on the very first page, like
on the front it says exercises and discussions on story writing.
Yeah. So, but she says that this is like, she considers it a workbook. I would more so maybe even put it into a reference book rather than a craft book, because it is so like specific to writing. Just because it's like punctuation and you know what I mean, things like that, which is more reference material to me than like the craft of storytelling.
Do you remember the year it came out originally? Was it 1998?
98, yeah.
Yeah.
So, which actually isn't that long ago to begin with, but it's definitely for her later years, and like toward the end of her like sort of writing career-ish. I mean, I guess maybe not, like, she wasn't young is what I'm trying to say. She had a lot of books under her belt by the time she
I'm saying this is her list of things she's written at that point.
Yeah, and to be clear, especially because I do have some criticisms of it, to be clear, this is not at all a criticism of her as a writer. Like, she's a prolific, sci-fi writer. She's fantastic. Like, I've heard nothing but great things. And I think I said this in another video that like a friend of mine, Ursula Le Guin was a family friend. So it was like her auntie Ursula, and she, so it's like, I've heard nothing but like amazing things about what a good mentor she was and how, whatever. So I just want to be clear that I'm not at all critiquing her as a writer or any of her books or anything. But I did, in terms of like, I definitely just would not say it's a craft book. I would say it's just like, she's had a long literary career. These are things that she thinks are really important that writers should know. And so she's kind of compiled them from her experience. It kind of reminds me of a master class in a lot of ways too, now that I've been taking some of those, because I don't feel like the master classes are teaching craft either, really. It's more like, I'm a master in this field. Here are my overall thoughts and things that I could impart on somebody new, so it's a little different in that sense. But I wanted to ask you guys something just to start off, because on the very first page, she says that this is not a book for beginners. And so would you guys agree with that?
No.
I think to an extent, and not to an extent. I think that it's not really a book for someone who isn't serious about writing and who isn't serious about trying to take their writing to the next level. But I actually think that this is a great book for a group of people who need to kind of expand on who want to come together as a writing group, but who need to expand on maybe their vocabulary for critiquing, and also to kind of help them see what you're looking for in other people's writing and your own, especially in revision.
Yeah, I actually, that's one of the areas I did really like about this book, is when she's talking about workshopping and like how you should respond. Like, there was something she said, and I don't think I like wrote it down in my notes, but there was something she said about like, if there's something like wrong with someone's book and you see a way they could fix it, you shouldn't make suggestions on how to fix it, because it's their book and it's okay to like point something out, but don't tell them what to do to change it, because then you're taking ownership of their like writing and I kind of like that, because especially if you're like a newer writer, or you're like, you don't have, an extensive catalog behind you to back you up. Like, who are you to tell people what to do in their book to change something, right? It's one thing to like comment on something that maybe isn't working or needs to be looked at, but to like give people what they should do instead is, I kind of like that she was saying that.
I guess I agree that, but like, I just don't feel like this was, I think it's good for, like you said, like people that are serious about writing, but at the same time, I don't think it was teaching anything that you don't learn in a very low level creative writing class.
But that's why I think this is assigned in low level creative writing classes, right?
Yeah.
Because then you're learning it in writing class.
We read it in my senior level creative writing class.
Well, that's a whole other critique I have about creative.
No, wait, sorry. I'm sorry. It was my junior year.
I'll say, because that's a whole other critique I have about creative writing programs,
Yes.
And whether or not I feel like they're being helpful in terms of craft.
Yeah.
But I think, let's say someone isn't going to college or isn't taking creative writing classes, but they do take writing seriously and want to have like a workshop or a writing group, like Edward was saying, then I think that this would be an excellent book for them to use in lieu of having those creative writing courses.
I agree with that.
Creative writing professor. So yeah, so I definitely think, some of my critiques, and I think some of my critiques that I have of it too are probably personal. Someone who was used to be in academia and knowing some of the problems of academia, I definitely saw a lot of things I didn't like about academia being reiterated in this. So I feel like, for example, there was a lot of emphasis on a lot of her advice is for literary fiction. It's not for genre fiction, which is interesting because, I mean, she kind of writes. I mean, she does write literary genre fiction, I would say, but because I just think that a lot of the advice in this is speaking to a certain kind of writing. And it's also a little old school in terms of like writing as well. It's not like what contemporary people are writing, what publishers are expecting. I think that this advice worked for her because she was already sort of grandfathered into like, they take whatever she was writing, and when she started it was very different, the publishing world, and what expectations were. So
say all the examples in the version I have, which is older, are like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Bleak House, Lord of the Rings, The Lighthouse, Jacob's Dream. So they're like really old writing at that.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of comments too, and before we get on to other stuff about like giving suggestions, I mean, I think that that's personal, like whether or not you want to tell them a specific way to fix things. I personally, agreed with what she was saying, that you shouldn't say like, oh, instead make him. I think she's talking more like general whole story changes, and she's trying to keep you from taking the ownership away from somebody. And I also think that if you have, I think that she's speaking to like a certain kind of people too, like someone who like for example, me. I don't feel comfortable, maybe only to Kevin because he's my brother. I don't feel comfortable telling people how to change their books because who am I? What have I published? What do I know? Like, and it's not my book, and I shouldn't be pushing Kevin to change the trajectory of his book or his vision or how he's doing something. I can tell him how something isn't working, or maybe make some suggestions like in general, like, oh, maybe you should consider this about the character, but I'm not going to say, instead of doing this, your character should go to this place and do this thing and say this thing instead.
If I'm being really honest too, it also depends on, like you said, like kind of like a credentials thing. Like I'm more likely to listen to a suggestion my agent makes rather than
exactly
a beta reader, because my agent does sell books. She knows what she's talking about, or like an editor. Like Alexa said that her editor suggested something that made a huge difference on her book. And I feel like that's another thing. It's like, it depends on, like, I wouldn't give a suggestion because, again, I haven't published anything, so what do I know? But an editor who's published lots of books knows more.
And it's not to say that you can't give any sort of like helpful suggestions about, it's more about like what kinds of suggestions you're doing and how much you're sort of imparting your own vision to somebody else's vision, if that makes sense. And again, that's debatable. I just agreed with the way she was sort of presenting that. So.
Well, and she actually. Oh, I'm sorry. You can go.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say, she actually says one of my favorite things in the introduction too. In my version, it's on page 12 of the introduction. But just basically about how, like, at the end of the day, your writing is your own, and it's like ultimately you need to stand by the decisions that you make in your writing. That is, especially when I used to work with students on writing and composition courses, so not anything fun like fiction, but that was something that I was always trying to express to them too. Like, these are ideas that I have, but you're the one who's turning this in. You're going to get a grade on this. People are not going to think of me when they think of this writing. They're going to think of you.
Exactly.
And I do think she does a good job of putting that into words, just as far as like, you need to stand by your writing because it's just yours.
Yeah, I think that's great. When I was in grad school, I worked at a writing center tutoring, writing. And that was the same thing as like, we always emphasize when you're giving suggestions, but these are just like suggestions. These are not like you need to have ownership of your own writing, of your own ideas. And I can maybe help steer, in certain directions, or offer up suggestions, but yeah, I think it's about standing by what you write and it's still being your own voice and your own vision and your own ideas. For sure.
Phoebe said that she gives a range of suggestions that might spark an idea that a writer can build on, that's what I like. And I think that's actually what a lot of what my agent does. She's like, what about something like this? So that way it gets my mind turning rather than you need to change it to this. It's like, here's an idea that you can run with.
I always love running my ideas by my husband because he gives me a tons of suggestions that I would never do. But when he gives me a bunch of suggestions that I would never do, it helps me think of my own ways of fixing things because his out there ideas lead me in a different direction than what I typically think. And it helps me get to something that I want to do. So, but yeah, I really kind of like that idea of like, you could do this or maybe this, you know, just to help spark ideas for someone to come to their own rather than trying to take ownership and saying, instead, you need to do this. Like it has to go like this, or this person should do this. So yeah, but yeah, getting back to like the beginners thing, I think it just depends. Like, I just thought it was interesting. She said it's not for beginners when I feel like most seasoned writers, well, actually, I don't know if that's true. Say most of the seasoned writers should already know a lot of this, but then I don't know. Because also my experience is very different. As someone who's in academia, I might know a lot of these things just because of my my career field rather than like some other people that maybe didn't. But that's just for me. I felt like I do feel like it's for beginners to an extent, you know. Like I wouldn't say someone who has like a lot of books under their belt that are like published or like at whatever would maybe necessarily, although maybe they do. I don't know.
Some people, unfortunately.
Maybe. So let me see. I'm trying to see what notes I had. I had some things that I like points in particular. Was there anything in particular that you guys thought was really, really helpful, or like what are some sections in here that you thought were the most helpful?
The thing that I reference this book for the most is whenever I'm trying to help somebody understand their the tense that they're writing in, or when I'm trying to understand what they're doing with their voice. The quote that I think that I literally all the time tell people the quote about how the whole point of being a certain kind of monk is to become self-aware, and it takes a lifetime. So sometimes writing in the present tense can be impossible and such an impediment. So I reference that the very most from this book, I think. I also too, I really, even though I think they're so tedious and they're like getting your fingernails ripped off, the exercises being gorgeous and also chastity, which okay. Those exercises I think are also pretty helpful and a good stimulating thing to do for the brain when you're just trying to get into the mode to write.
Yeah, I thought about that because I primarily write first person, and I've been thinking a lot lately about a couple of books ideas that I have for the future, that I would want to maybe do them in third person. And I've been kind of thinking what do you use to determine that? How do you decide what mode would be better? And at the time I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but the more I thought about it, where, she says that when you're writing in that first person is impossible to, I'm trying to remember exactly how she said it. I think I had it, but what she was saying about writing first person, you don't have that reflection, everything, the immediacy of it. You can't really see what's happening. If that makes sense. If I had the freaking quote, it would make more sense. But
I think it's on 52 is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you have this version.
Yeah, I have your version. Because I'm trying to paraphrase it and I'm not getting there. So
definitely not 52 in my book.
52
on my book is a blank page.
I actually think I went to a different section because I'm somewhere that's talking about past tense and you're talking first person.
Yeah.
I actually really liked at the time when I was younger, I really liked the exercises in this. I don't know why hers were different to me, because a lot of the exercises in the other books, I'm like, no. But this one to me, I just like them. But I'm thinking it's because, again, it's I have all these nostalgic feelings attached to it, so it's like hard for me to separate that feeling from this book.
There were some exercises in it I really liked. I marked 2 of them that I plan to use in the future. The exercises on like the way things sound. I don't remember what the name of it was. And then the exercise I wrote down on page 45. So
yeah, for exercise names.
Yeah, the Daphne one is the one that you mentioned, Edward. That one where she says to write a paragraph to a page of descriptive narrative prose without adjectives or adverb and no dialogue. Just as sort of like the point is to give a vivid description of a scene or an action using only verbs, nouns, pronouns, and articles. I think that seems like a really helpful exercise, and it's something that I would like to try, definitely, to try to like pare down descriptions, because that is actually one of the things I did mark that I liked a lot just in general about this is her discussion of descriptions, and I really like her recommendation of writing all the description first and then pare it down and then go back. Like, don't worry about like, because later you should be thinking more thoughtfully about what description you need and how it's functioning in the scene. But when you're first writing, just get it all out. Just describe the whole thing, you know, and sort of this idea of overwriting and then paring it down.
I just like a lot of these exercises, and I don't think exercises are for everyone, but again, if you're a beginner, I think that these exercises are good. But that's my own opinion.
Yeah.
I like them.
Well, and to draw it back to that idea of this not being for beginners, that's also something, I think, again, these are actually really great foundational exercises for a group who is trying to trust each other in critique, you know?
Yeah.
I think these would be really good. Like if you have a critique group to do this with them and then like exchange, I think that would be great to do that.
She also talking about like tenses also. She talks about writers who only use one tense is like a painter with a set of oil paints who only uses pink. Like I like that analogy. Right, that like different tools, you know, should be used for different things and to only stick to one. I think that was an interesting.
That's something that I think about all the time actually too when it comes to revision, and it's something that always makes me think like maybe I need to rewrite this in a different person or in a different tense just to see what happens, and it always makes me want to take more risks in my writing that I usually wouldn't.
Yeah. So I finally found the quote that I was talking about point of view. So it's on page 53. She says, the novelist Lynn Sharon Swartz argued that present tense narration, avoiding temporal context and historical trajectory, oversimplifies, suggesting that nothing is terribly complex, which, okay, I don't really care for that necessarily, but and that understanding such as it is can be achieved by naming objects or accumulating data, and that all we can ever understand is what can be understood from a glimpse. So like, I don't know, like on the one hand, it felt like there was a little bit of a opinion of hers on present tense. Like she made it seem like it was in fashion and that's how people were doing things. But I do like this idea of thinking about like what kinds of stories can be told in present tense versus past tense, and first person versus third person, and really like being mindful and purposeful of like what the intention is and what the kind of story it is and what kinds of things you're trying to do with the story, to make those kinds of choices and understanding what you can get out of the different types of tenses and things. So yeah. So I'm trying to, let's see. So I want to try to talk about good things before I talk about things that I didn't like, because there are good things in here.
I think that this is an easy read.
Oh yeah, it's a quick read for sure.
Like there are some other ones we've read where like it just felt like a slog to read through it and to get through it. Some other crap books that we've done, and I feel like this one was easy to read, which I feel like is a plus because it's accessible, I think.
Yeah.
It's really in digestible chunks, I think, too.
Yes.
Nothing is ever too long, I think.
I agree.
Yeah. so I like, let's see, my notes here, I said that I like that she really emphasizes that it's important that you know your craft. This is something I can't emphasize enough. Just my personal opinion is like, you can be born with a natural ability for art, but that doesn't mean you have nothing to gain from studying and honing your craft. Even if you are an artist, artists still take courses. They still learn from other previous painters or sculptors or whatever. They study what they want to do. They listen to other people in the field. They practice, they hone, they don't just leave it up to this innate ability. And I really appreciate that in terms of like my own self. And because I thought, and I'll be really honest, like I went to college, I have an advanced degree in writing. So when I came to writing fiction, I was like, okay, I don't really need to read a bunch of craft books. Like I'm a good writer. Like I know what I'm doing. I understand. I studied literature at the advanced level. I can write it, But then I started writing it and I started realizing, okay, maybe I have something I could learn from other people. And then now that I've read so many craft books, like I can't emphasize enough how much more confident I feel in my writing. Like I feel like I understand what I'm doing better and I don't feel like I'm floundering and kind of just like deciding things randomly. And I really like that in this book, she really emphasizes that it's important that if you want this as a career or as something that you take very seriously, that you should take it seriously, that you should continue to learn your craft, to make it important, to always be trying to learn and grow and understand and know what it is that you're doing. And I especially think if we're thinking about beginners, even though she says it's not for beginners, if we think about beginners reading this, then I do think that that's an important point to make, is that it is important that you take it seriously. That you're always trying to level up, in your writing. And then like some general like advice she gives, I like she really emphasizes sentence variety. I cannot emphasize that enough myself. Like as somebody who used to teach writing, I used to always try to explain this to students. Like you need to think about things on the sentence level. You need to think about how they sound, the cadence, the aesthetic. All of those things go into readability, and you want to have variety. I just took the Margaret Atwood masterclass, and she talks about this as well, where you have like really fancy writing, the Baroque, and then you have like the really simple plain song. And she's saying that most good writing is a mix of both, that you don't just do one or the other, and knowing what types of sentences or what areas should have those kinds of sentences and which ones should be more, you want to think about emphasis, aesthetic, readability, and all those kinds of things. And so she really emphasizes sentence variety, which I think is something that people often overlook in their writing, because we have our own way of like talking. So we kind of just, when we're doing revisions, we're not thinking about at the sentence level, that kind of stuff.
That's something that I actually carried from this book. It's still something I work on and struggle with, is sentence variety, but I remember that being something that stood out to me when I first read this.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not something I would like stress about when you're like in your first draft or like your second draft. But when you're in a later draft, when you're really going in at the sentence level and really looking at things, I think that that's something to really consider as you're and she emphasizes, and so does Margaret Atwood, like you should try to hear it. What does it sound like?
That was specifically what I was going to draw attention to too, is the way that she does talk about the power of like hearing something out loud and reading it out loud. And the examples that she gives, the first few examples at the beginning of the book on just like page 3 and 4, I'm reading some of those out loud. Especially, I personally just love Zora Neale Hurston. She's one of my favorite writers. Yeah. So reading that just first paragraph out loud, it's just like, oh my gosh, writing can be so good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love that. And that's something I always, like I would recommend to students, is read your papers out loud. Read the things that, I mean, there's lots of reasons to do that, but one of them, I mean, if we want to get, into like science, one of them is when you read aloud, you use a different part of your brain than when you read silently. So it's coming into your brain differently. And so you're going to notice things that you wouldn't notice when you're reading silently. Things are going to stick out. because when you're reading silently, the part of your will like fill things in, or you're not hearing how they sound. And I think I read everything. Like when my poor husband, because he's always the one who listens to stuff, and he usually just tunes out, but it makes me feel more comfortable if I'm reading to somebody rather than to myself. But my master's thesis was like 150 pages, 160 pages, and I read the entire thing out loud to my husband. So it's like,
how many times?
yeah. So it's just like there was so many, like we spent hours where I was just reading it out loud, like when I was fine tuning everything, because it makes a huge difference in readability. And then when you're talking about fiction, you want a certain kind of sound as well. It's not the same kind of sound as if, writing a thesis or a composition paper, but the way things sound makes a huge difference in how someone takes in the story. So I really liked that.
Mm-hmm.
And it also helps for catching errors. And
when I'm working on agent edits, I often read a lot of them out loud. I don't even think to, I just do it. It helps a lot.
When I'm editing dialogue, I read the dialogue out loud because I think about how people would say it. Because because I have an academic background, I tend to write with no contractions because in academic writing, you don't write with contractions. And of course, most people speak in contractions. And so I write dialogue more formally in my first and second drafts, so that when I'm revising dialogue, I have to say it out loud so that I hear how it should actually be said. I'm like, okay, no one would say that. No one would say, I am blah, blah, blah all the time, right? They would just say, I'm, so like things like that. So
Jessica said that she used the voice function in Word to have the computer read her book to her. It's weird, but super helpful.
That would be
super weird, but helpful. I've never used it, so I don't know how I feel like I'd be in the movie Blank Check when he uses the computer to talk to people.
Say that again?
The movie Blank Check, he uses the computer to talk to people.
Oh, yeah. Blank Check, oh my God.
That is something too. One of my mentors from college always used to recommend like finding someone who you really trust and getting them to read your work out loud to you, especially too, because then hearing what they struggle to read to you when they're just kind of sight reading there on the page can also be very informative about what's not working.
Interesting. Yeah.
But you have to find someone you trust for that.
Yeah.
No, I don't even trust myself that much.
Someone who's good at reading aloud, because I think some people get like nervous about how they're reading and stuff. So yeah, you have someone who can like do that. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to try. Let's see. I also like that she warns about qualifiers. This is something I do, like, I'm so terrible at. And it's something that this is something probably everyone already knew this, and I'm just the big idiot who didn't know this. But something that I have recently from reading craft books have realized that I've been doing wrong, and it kind of goes to the qualifier section that she talks about, is that I was always trying to make, and several craft books and master classes I've watched have corrected me on this, and it makes total sense. I have always tried to make my dialogue realistic, and dialogue in books are not supposed to be realistic. Like, you shouldn't write how people actually talk, like,
because we never say anything.
Yeah, like, well, because for example, I say like all the time. I do it all the time. Like, it's just a thing that I do. I say a lot. So I was always writing characters because I wanted it to be realistic. And it's like, okay, but this is a book. It's not supposed to be realistic, right? Like, no one wants your boring chitter chatter about nothing. Because like sometimes I would do a scene where it's like, okay, well, it would be realistic that they would sit here and talk about this like one thing. And then all these craft books are like, only have dialogue that is serving a purpose. Don't have just people chatting. And I just was like, but it's realistic. And it's like, who's asking it to be realistic? Like, who wants, So it's like, that's something.
I mean, it needs to be realistic to a point, but not to the point where it doesn't serve the story.
Right, but that's what they're saying, is that you're supposed to isolate, you're supposed to, and that one of the craft books I read, I can't remember, was talking about like conversation. You should think about dialogue as conflict, that every conversation should have tension. There should be a back and forth. And so just thinking about it like that helped put it in perspective. But I like what she's talking about with qualifiers because I'm terrible with this, with putting in qualifiers. So she really emphasizes that in her adjectives and adverbs section. And I mean, I'll get to like some of the things she said about advice, like common advice thing. But one thing I think sometimes we hear these common writing advice things, but we're interpreting them wrong. And I think the reason why the emphasis is to not use so many adverbs and adjectives is not because you shouldn't have adverbs and adjectives. It's because usually you should be using more precise language, right? Like if you're using an adverb or an adjective to like describe something, there may be a better word that means that thing. So it's not about like never using an adjective, never using an adverb. It's like, okay, is there an opportunity for more precise language here to describe that same thing?
I'm looking down. I'm taking notes as we're talking. I realize I'm like looking down a lot. I take notes.
Because a different craft book we read also said, like, I've had several common writing tips that I've heard even here on AuthorTube, where it's like for example, like your character should have a flaw, right? And I think a lot of people interpret that as like a flaw, like, oh, my flaw is I always bite my nails, or I always interrupt people when they speak. But then one of the craft books I read was like, no, you should think about a flaw as a misbelief, right? Like a misbelief that they have that is preventing them from reaching the goal that they want, and that through their journey they learn how to correct that misbelief. So I think that's a better, you know what I mean? So oftentimes that's why like sometimes I hate these sort of like AuthorTube videos or like little snippets on the internet on websites where they give these really general writing advice and then people are interpreting them not in the most productive way. And she does talk about that too in terms of passive and active voice. Like, I guess that sometimes the general advice is like never write in passive voice. And she's saying that's not true, right? Like there are instances where passive voice is appropriate. It just depends on the context and what you're writing and where. Yeah, Lizelle, the lie they believe. Definitely. And I think it was Writing Deep Scenes that called it like a misbelief, but yes. That's the flaw. The flaw is not like a character trait per se, you know.
Agreed.
Yeah, precise language I definitely think is very hard. It's something definitely to do in the revision process. Because I do want to give a caveat to using a thesaurus for synonyms. Because you have to understand context, right? Like certain words are used in certain contexts. And so like an example is like heavy and fat, right? They're synonyms, but like you're not going to call a heavy book like fat.
I would.
You know, like
Yeah,
that book.
But you know what I mean? Like you wouldn't like just because something's synonym doesn't mean you use it to describe that kind of thing. So I would always warn students against that. Like, don't just randomly grab a synonym. It needs to work in the context in which you're talking about. And so, yeah, so you have like, so that kind of goes to with like adverbs and adjectives. It's about looking at synonyms, but looking at the definition, looking at them of how they're used in sentences, in what context, and trying to find. And the best way I would recommend that you expand your vocabulary is reading other books. And when you come across a word that you don't know, look it up. Or
the plus side of reading on Kindle. If you don't know a word, you just click on it and it'll tell you right there.
Yeah, so it's just like looking up word. I mean, my students would always scoff at that when I'm like, have a dictionary with you when you read. It's like, oh, who wants to look up words?
I will say nowadays, you don't need a dictionary. You can just look it up on your phone.
But it's just like, okay, like, yes, you can assume the definition of something through context clues often. But if you, as a writer, are trying to level up, then you should be reading intentionally as well as for enjoyment. And not just for words you don't know, but like maybe they used a word that you're like, oh, that was a really good word here. I should write that down, right? That's something I could use in the future, right? So being sort of like using your reading experience for both of those things, right? For not just enjoyment.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. So let's see, what are some other, because I had some things too that I was like curious what other people thought. Oh, okay. So this was a very controversial thing she said. I felt like she says books don't have to have a plot.
I mean, I kind of see that in a lot of literary fiction.
This is why I was, yes. Okay, so like, this is one of those things where I feel like that's just not really true anymore, even for literary fiction. I just don't think you can get away with that really anymore. Even in like lit fiction that's being published now, like expectations of publishing and readers are very different. And yes, and that's what I think was sort of problem. One of the issues I had with the book is that all of her examples are classic literature. And I think her reason was kind of bullshit because she said it's like cheaper to include classics. Like her reason was like, I use classics as examples because oftentimes it's too expensive to use excerpts from contemporary books or they're not available.
Well, something that's interesting about that too. I listened to the podcast she did about this book with David Naiman, Between the Covers, and on that podcast, she's lamenting about the way, specifically how she feels like so many literary female writers who are like popular in the moment, but who are going to be like forgotten by the end of the decade, just because, that's the way the system works. Like if you don't have a book that sells big to make a name for yourself that they make into a TV show, you're not going to be remembered for too long. So I think it's interesting that she is lamenting about that at the same time too. And then like, this is actually would have been an opportunity to promote those writers that she was talking about. And also to show, I'm Ursula K Le Guin and I'm saying these writers have exceptional craft here in my book about craft.
Yes. For like her exact words are, I've taken from older works of fiction because permission to quote from contemporary works is often expensive or unavailable, and because I love and am familiar with these older books. It's like, okay.
So because you love and are familiar with the older books.
Yes. And so it's just like, okay, but this is for the 21st century, right? And if you're updating this, you cannot use only classics as examples of anything. It's just not going to work. And I think that that's a problem sometimes with writing now, is that people are looking at classics and the things that people could get away with. And classics you can't get away with now.
I have a question. When did the updated version come out? Like what year?
2010 or 15?
Yeah,
I thought 2015. That's when she did the podcast.
Did she actually do the updated version, or did the publisher do it?
She did it.
She says in the introduction that she literally rewrote every single page of the book.
Okay.
One after the other.
Yeah, it's 2015. And also, I don't think it's true that it's too expensive, because every craft book I've read has used like contemporary major. Okay,
but Save the Cat. This book uses so many. So many.
I think it's Writing Deep Scenes also uses a lot of really, like, it uses Night Circus, it uses The Fault in Our Stars. I mean, it uses really like commercially well-known, popular contemporary books. And so that is kind of my biggest critique of the book, is that I just feel like it is a little antiquated, even though she's saying it's updated for the 21st century. It didn't feel very updated for the 21st century writer. And I think that it also was a little like skewed toward literary fiction and towards this type of writing that doesn't really work now.
I agree with what Alexa said, though, is that you can't write like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens in 2020. That a lot of those plots, we love them, but they barely have a plot, and they wouldn't sell maybe outside of lit fic.
Yeah, and I would argue, that even lit fiction now has most.
Yeah. Well, I think too, if plot doesn't seem so prevalent, there is at least such a powerful transformation within a character in the book that it's at least like there's some sort of huge change happening, you know. And I do think in literary fiction that does kind of happen in lieu of plot, but it's really just a way of seeing plot in another way, I'd say.
Exactly, 100%. And I think it's like a misnomer to just be like, oh, you don't need a plot. It's like, she has a very specific definition of plot, which is what I would say every other craft book says is plot. So I'm not disagreeing with that. But she's saying like not all books have to have that kind of plot. That I agree with. But then say they don't have to have that kind of plot. Don't say they don't need a plot. Like, because I think that could be, especially for a beginning writer, could be a little confusing. Like, oh, I don't have to have a plot. I can just freaking write. They're like, sure, you can. Is that going to be successful? Is someone going to want to publish that or read it? Like, you have to really know what you're doing. And most of the time, the reason why these got away with it in classic literature is they were new for the time, right? Like, it was a new way of writing and people weren't doing it as much. And it's only been in the last, since the internet really, that so many people are pursuing writing and we're seeing so many different types and styles. So a lot of this was just because people were first. Like, I'll be honest, the fact that she uses Virginia Woolf as an example for anything, it's horrifying.
Well, that's her number one, though. She loves Virginia Woolf. She thinks
like Virginia Woolf is the worst example to give to somebody trying to write right now.
Yeah.
I also hate all of Virginia Woolf's writing.
I cannot stand Virginia Woolf. I'm sorry. But that's a personal opinion. I'm just saying that style of writing would never work now. No one would ever write something like anything that Virginia Woolf has written and get away with it. It just wouldn't happen. Baby says don't come for Woolf. It's just not my personal style, right? Of like, I love a lot of classic literature. Like, it's just not Virginia Woolf. I just don't care for her. She's not for me. But I just don't think she is a good example of
I think there's a really great quote that is fun to read that also kind of, I think, shows how out of touch she is with 2020. I know this book is 5 years old now, but how out of touch she is with 2020. And I actually wrote in my margins, okay, boomer, just because I've been desperate to use that the right way. But she says in my version, it's on page 16 right at the top, she says, emoticons are dreary little excuses for a failure to communicate feelings and intentions in words. And I just feel like, wrong. No, emoticons are beautiful and they're art and they're emojis. Get with it. Well, I actually said emoticons until like a year ago, though. So I might have an AARP card too.
Yeah, that I honestly feel like is my biggest critique, is that this does not feel updated for the 21st century. It feels like an old lady in the 21st century trying to sound like she's with it, but a lot of her examples are just not. It's just not aware of like current publishing. Like, she could get away with these things because she has the back catalog, because she's prolific, because she's been doing it for a long time, or she was, when she wrote this. But it just wouldn't work now. It wouldn't work now. And I just hated all the classic examples. I mean, this is something that I don't like. I mean, most craft books don't use classics as examples for this reason. And also, even like, when I was in graduate school and took a course on composition theory, like, we're taught, like, don't use classic novels to teach anything with writing, because it's just, things were so different and the way things were published were different. Punctuation things are different. Like, everything is so different. And it's been proven through studies that it doesn't help people learn anything. Like, it's not good for any sort of writing to use like classics. Like, you can, in terms of like generalizations about like, of course I'm not saying you can't learn something from Shakespeare, but you're not going to replicate exactly how Shakespeare writes. So like, I think that there's a difference there in what you are able to learn from those. So I was really disappointed in that part of it. And I would say too, especially because because I did study creative writing in college, as well, and this is exactly the problem, is that they're always skewing you to literary fiction, as if that's the only way to write, as if that's the most important way of writing. And while I appreciate literary fiction, I love it, most people are not even writing that. you know? So it's like expanding that a little bit and not being so narrowly focused.
Literary fiction, I feel like, especially trying to find your voice within it too, honestly, to me, feels so limiting. And it's like the medium of writing that almost takes away the most imagination out of writing, for me personally. And I'm like rebounding too, because when I was in my creative writing program, of course, except for in courses where we were specifically writing genre, it's like literary fiction is all that's accepted. And if you're, and most syllabuses, it even says like, if I perceive your work to be genre, you could get a 0.
I'm actually surprised we had any genre courses because my creative writing program did not do that.
Yeah, well, my
course.
Yeah. The program that I was in, has a really nice MFA program, so that was kind of steering the way for the undergraduate program. The like director of their program is pretty young and hip, so he's seeing a lot of ways that I mean it's still staying so literary, but the way that like genre is blending into a lot of what's becoming very popular in literary fiction through like what we would call magical realism or surrealism maybe, or
because I did creative writing as an undergrad and I also did English, and when I was trying to decide which one to get my master's in, I specifically steered away from the MFA because the program at the school that I was at and the ones I looked into, they don't even let you do any still. Like I feel like a lot of programs, it depends on the age of the people that are heading your program too. Do not even allow, like it was literally like you said, like in syllabi, it was like you cannot write genre fiction. I won't let you, write anything that is perceived that way. And so that's why this book kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I felt like this is just another instance of something really skewing toward literary fiction. And while she wasn't talking poorly of genre fiction, but a lot of the advice I felt like was in the examples really kind of pushed you in that direction. And I personally, when I was younger, felt a lot of pressure to write literary fiction. And that's why it took me until my 30s to allow myself to actually pursue the kind of writing that I want, because I suck at literary fiction. Like I'm not good at it. I tried it for years and years and years, and I thought that just meant I was a bad writer. And then I finally realized, no, I'm just bad at writing that. Like I can appreciate it, but I can't write it. And so I think that sometimes we don't realize that like having things like this, that while they're not speaking poorly of genre, are also not elevating it, makes it feel as if it's a secondary choice of writing.
Well, and I would even go as far as to say, too, that I think it's damaging, really, for a number of reasons. One, because I think in many circles, Le Guin is considered to be like the mother of science fiction, really, to be the most prominent female science fiction writer in the American canon, basically.
100%.
But then also, too, there is the implied minimization of like other forms of writing as art, and which I've talked about before. Honestly, even writing a letter to me is art. Writing your 5-paragraph essay, as boring as it may be, is still art. Like using words to communicate effectively is an art, no matter what you're communicating. So I do think it is, and that is one of the gatekeeping things that frustrates me the most about writing. And finally, too, as like a final point on that, I think it's funny as well because she is also known as someone who really did knock down a lot of gates in writing, and so it's funny that she would subversively kind of be guarding this one.
Yeah, that's why, exactly. And that's why I was just kind of disappointed. I was like, oh, I thought, as this like female, like you said, science fiction really paving the way for a lot of people to kind of still default to some of these antiquated ways. I was like, oh gosh, it's a little disappointing. So yeah, definitely. Let's see what else. She definitely had like a lot of hot takes, I felt like, throughout the book. I noted a few of them. Some of the hot takes she had were a little confusing to me also, and I think that this reflected it not being as updated to the 21st century as I felt, is she would say that writing teachers give this kind of advice, and it's advice that like people do not give anymore. Like that's not true. She's like, well, they'll tell you can't use the same word twice on one page. I've literally never heard anyone ever say that ever. Warning against repetition is not like a arbitrary advice where you say only one time on the page. Like no one said, who's saying that? Who
Never heard that.
Never heard that in my life. Or where she was talking about, there was something else.
I mean, I've heard like don't use the same word like in the same sentence or the same paragraph, but like never on the same page.
But even then, like as a writing teacher, you don't ever give absolute advice. You never say, don't use the same word twice in a sentence, because it depends on the sentence. It depends on the cadence, the emphasis, what the sentence is. So it's just like, that may have been how people were teaching writing in like the 70s and the 80s. But I'm telling you, in the 2000s, people are not, writing teachers, young writing teachers are not telling students that.
I've literally never heard that.
So there was some, I'm trying to see.
According to Alexa and Lizelle, some copy editors will.
I want to know what words you are only allowed to use once.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what words it is. Because if it's something that really stands out, I guess I could see that. But like, I just feel like most words.
I just have a lot of opinions on this, just especially because so much of this is like writing rather than fiction stuff. I just have a lot of opinions on some of this stuff. I will say that also you have to think about your copy editors are people with bachelor's degrees who had old teachers who were telling them bad advice. So they're just regurgitating bad advice that they got. So like I've had people say like, oh, well, my friend is an editor and he puts 2 spaces after the period. Well, I'm glad that he does that, but just because he's an editor doesn't mean he is devoid of mistakes. Because if we want to talk about mistakes, you guys, I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you, but Ursula Le Guin does not understand the difference between a coordinating and subordinating conjunction. And I was very irritated in her punctuation chapter that in a paragraph lambasting incorrect punctuation, she has incorrect punctuation. So you can't always take that as to be true, and it's only as good as like the information they're getting. And so that's why I think like she's saying that people say that, but it's like no one's saying that now. It's being passed down from like old regime, like old regime advice. And that's why I was just like, okay, if you're going to update it to the 21st century, like.
I feel like, so going back to the repetition thing, because Alexa brought hers up, bog standard, I would not assume that would come up more than once in an entire manuscript, because who even says that? She said it was only allowed once because it's unusual to Americans. I agree with that, but I feel like that's a very specific word. Like that's a very, very specific thing.
That's the unicorn example we're talking about, like in general, like of course when you're using weird stuff that people don't say, then maybe, but yeah, Alexa, I've literally never even heard that. I don't even know what it means, so.
I think though that it also, like, even though your main character was British, I think it also depends, like, if you're writing for an American audience.
Yes, and it also, okay, if we're going to talk about how publishing works, which is very different, they also have their own. So you have a certain style that they're following, whether it's Chicago or whatever, and then also you have house styles. Yeah. So every publishing house has their own style of writing, and they're going to make, but those are not general rules for writing. It is their style, their manual style for their house on how they do things. So that's very different than like general writing. Yeah, that's okay. I'm gonna pass on the bog standard use. You can have it, Alexa. Yeah. I'm a little more John Q. Public with my vocabulary and language. I like so. And whinging, oh God.
I think again, like this goes back to like the audience you're writing for, because like whinging is a common word in like British
and Australian.
Yeah, and I only know that because of the British YouTubers I watch. But like, if you're writing for an American audience, you have to know that that's not a common word for Americans.
Yes, yes. But since I had already brought it up, I just want to say my biggest grievance of the book.
You already brought it up.
Yeah, but I want to just clarify the issue here. Is in her punctuation and grammar chapter. Which I guess I'm doing exactly what she doesn't want people to do. But on page 15, she says, wait, was this the example? Hold on. No, this might not have been the example. She basically she's using because as a coordinating conjunction and putting a comma before it. And you don't put commas before the word because when it's not a coordinating conjunction. It's a subordinating conjunction. And so you don't put a comma before it. And it was irritating because she does this throughout the book. So I don't know if that's a manual style or just like a publishing style that she's using, but it's incorrect. And I just felt it really weird that she's like going on and on about punctuation, how important it is, and then she uses it incorrectly there. And then later in another instance, when there's a sentence that starts with, a dependent clause and then goes into the independent clause, she doesn't put a comma between them when you're supposed to. And so it's in her punctuation chapter. So I was just like, oh, this is so irritating. And this is a common mistake. And then also technically, people would argue that, like, of course, language is always changing and it just matters who's using it and what. And like so many people use a comma or use the word because as a coordinating conjunction, even though it's technically not, that it's fine. But what I'm saying is don't go on and on about how important it is to know rules and to apply them appropriately when you're not doing it yourself. So that was like really annoying to me because I personally don't like when people... Like, I just feel like talking about punctuation in a book and then you're not doing it correctly is frustrating to me. As someone who taught grammar for so many years.
And I think that even as someone that hasn't taught grammar, I think it's weird to tout yourself as...
Yes, but what I'm saying is...
an expert at something if you're not.
Because then you get students who say, well, Ursula K Le Guin did this thing, and then I have to go on and on about how, like, people make mistakes, people think things are wrong. Also in fiction... I do like that she explains the difference that, like, you need to know the rules if you're going to break them. Because in fiction, you can have commas for cadence or fragments for cadence or emphasis or whatever, but it should be purposeful, not because you don't know how to use it or you don't know what is a complete sentence. But yeah. That was just a big irritation with me, like, through the whole book. I was just like, why does she keep using because as a coordinating conjunction when it's not? It's not.
I just want to say really quick that Alexa listed her echo words, and one of them was vomit, and I'm very intrigued as to how often you were using vomit in your book, that you were told to reduce it. What's going on in your book, Alexa?
Kevin, you use vomit a lot too, actually.
There's one scene where something's happening where he throws up a lot.
No, but a lot of the time, like, when your character...
What other words can you use?
A lot of time when your character is nervous, he thinks, I feel like I'm going to vomit. And I'm like, who thinks
that must be... It's not this book, girl. I can tell you right now. Sir, I'll search it right now.
Go do it right now. I don't believe it. Because I kept saying, you use vomit too much. I don't... Like, who uses, like, the word vomit? I don't know. What when you say, like, I feel like I'm going
to... Alexa said she uses it when her character's nervous.
I just think puke is what most people feel like. I feel like I'm going to puke, right? Vomit is such a violent word. I think that's actually a really good example, too, Alexa, when you're talking about only having a word once on a page. I think there are certain words that, yes, you probably shouldn't use them a lot in one space because something like vomit has such an...
I use vomit 6 times.
But if you use the word vomit like 4 times on a page, that would not work.
So I used it... I've used it twice on one page, but besides that, all the other 4 times were in different pages.
So 6 times.
6 times over, yes. And it's
That's a lot of vomit, Kevin.
I like the term vomit over throw up. I think I don't know, it doesn't roll off the tongue like vomit does for me. So
vomit is such a, like, if we're talking about how words sound, vomit has such a distinct emphasis and violence sound. To use it 6 times is kind of a lot. You tell me you never think puke?
No, I don't know. I like the word vomit. I like how it sounds. I like that it sounds violent. Alexa,
thank you. Thank you,
Alexa. Me and you.
I know a lot of people are saying that they got the notification for this.
I got it like 25 minutes after we started.
Yeah, I know. Like,
that's how I always get notifications for lives. Like, always, I feel like 10 to 15 minutes or 20 minutes. after they go live.
Stupid YouTube.
Hate us.
I don't really use. I try to use like different ways of talking about feeling nervous, but I would always just say puke. I feel like I'm gonna puke.
I don't know, like when I for instance, like on this one I put like my head lolls to the side before I can stop myself, I vomit. I wouldn't say like before I can stop myself, I throw up. I don't know, I just don't like it. It doesn't
well, that in that instance, but I'm talking about when you're talking about like internal, like, oh, I feel like I'm gonna.
I don't have it.
That's a dramatic word.
From when you read it, I don't use it for internalization anymore. I use it when he actually does.
Okay, so that's different, I feel like, than like vomit just has such a different connotation.
I will say in my everyday life, that's how I think about it. Like when I'm nervous, I don't ever think throw up or puke. I always think vomit.
Well, here's the thing. So here's what I'll say, since we're talking about this. I know that about you because, I know you, but it doesn't, it has to be what the character would say and how they sound. Does that make sense? So like,
you don't know my character.
Just because you think it and use it, is it the best choice for your character?
Sometimes,
You're very dramatic, Kevin. So it would make sense to me that
you're not dramatic.
Okay. Well, we'll pretend that's for
I'm
real.
Totally down to earth. Really quick, totally off subject. Once someone said that they liked me because they thought I was because of how down to earth I was, and I was like, okay, cool. Not at all. They did not.
Oh, that's funny. All right, what were some other? I think we kind of already covered all the other hot takes that she had, and my annoyance with her punctuation chapter and being wrong.
Here's what I'll say. Okay, this is what I didn't want to give away too early.
Okay.
In the chat. So, like thinking back, I really love this book because it was like one of the first ones. It was the first one I read, and I feel like it really changed who I was as like a baby writer. Going back now and rereading it, it's not as amazing as I held it up to be, which I kind of had a feeling it would be going in. And so, like, I was suggesting it to people like Laura. Again, at the beginning, before she had read too many craft books, but now that you've read so many, I don't know if I would recommend this. I wouldn't. Because you've already read so many, like I feel like this is one that you could probably pass over because you've already read so many. Do I think that she has some good snippets? Yes, but I think that a lot of the stuff was already covered, or you get basically the same gist reading other ones. So, like thinking back on like young me, then yes, like I was like, I love this book. I love it still because again, I have like this nostalgia like feeling attached to it. And because of that, I'll keep it. But I don't think it's like one I just widely recommend to everyone.
I think that it's a book too that about 80 or 90% of its content you can actually outgrow too. So where it's just really it's not even useful to you anymore once you kind of know it.
Yes.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. But I do think, like I said, like if someone doesn't have the ability to take a creative writing course in college and they didn't take any in high school and they really feel like they don't understand some of these concepts that were maybe addressed in an early on creative writing course, that this could be helpful. Like especially the glossary, I think is helpful if you really don't. I mean, because I think for sometimes we assume everyone knows these words, and that's just not the case. Like not everyone understands like what is onomatopoeia or colloquialisms or things like that. That are like sort of academic words that not everyone. That's a privileged point of view to assume that everyone knows those words. So not everyone has that, not everyone knows that. So I do think that like there are certain aspects of this book that could be helpful to certain level of writers in their journey and where they have gone. But in terms of like, if you're someone who's, taking courses, you've been doing this for a while, you've read other craft books, I think it kind of just emphasized for me things I already knew. But it was kind of nice hearing her say it, And that's kind of how I felt about, I don't want to give too much away how I feel about master classes because I will be doing reviews of those, but that's kind of how I feel about master classes too. It's like having certain aspects of writing emphasized by people that you trust their opinion helps solidify it. So the fact that it's coming from Le Guin and it's her sort of telling you like, look, from my experience of all these years of writing, these are really important things. Knowing what she thinks is important, I think is helpful as someone who has that like that ethos, a very committed beginner or maybe a more mid-level writer who's comfortable with storycraft but really wants to practice with specific skills like tense and such. Yes, and it's really just like scratching the surface, but then maybe it kind of leads you to know like, okay, well, where should I continue on to learn about? And there was something else she said. Well, she does say, I think it was on this page where she was like, okay, yeah, where she says, this is another example of like people don't say this anymore. Okay. She said, because she has these fake rules, which I'm calling her hot takes on stuff, right? So she says a fake rule is the generic pronoun in English is he. People do not default to he anymore. I mean, that is a very purposeful thing that I feel like, at least when I was in like composition theory and teaching composition, we always teach to say he or she, or to vary it, you know, and most craft books vary it. Or actually now, because people want gender inclusive language, there is, while it may not technically be correct grammatically, most teachers and most young people that are getting into the teaching field are leaning toward that gender inclusive language. So I don't think anyone's teaching to default to he.
This is something that she discussed in that podcast as well, actually, because one of her, I think it's The Left Hand of Darkness, but I could be wrong, which is like her big work. It has a whole race of people who are genderless until a certain point in their life. And when she wrote it originally, she was told she had to go with he, basically, and she had experimented with them, making them, because also I think this came out in the late 70s, so right. That's also telling. And then she had also experimented with making them she always, instead of always making them he, and she personally didn't like the way that sounded to her. And then she also said she's always just had like an aversion to created pronouns. But yeah. when she re-released this book, she also re-released that book. And I think that she still chose to keep everything as he because there was some resistance to using they in 2015. And I do think that that's around the time she passed away as well.
Yeah.
So there wasn't much time for her to come into this moment. But I do think, especially around pronouns, that is something that we have evolved so quickly on as far as our mainstream conversations around it. I think it's been kind of a decade in the making for, you know, maybe people who identify as queer in some way, but not, it's only just now, I feel like, even in the last year or two, getting into like our mainstream conversation.
Yeah, 100%. Because the last time I taught was like 2 years ago. And so the textbooks that I was using always would say that if you didn't know the gender, that you should say he or she. But they would always say that they is wrong, even 2 years ago. It was said that, but I personally, as an instructor, never told people that was wrong. And I always emphasize that I encourage, you know, gender inclusiveness. And most of my colleagues who were around the same age range did the same. So I would always make the caveat, yes, the textbook says he or she, but if you use they, I'm not going to mark you wrong for that. I'm not going to consider that wrong. But I never, ever saw anything that said you should default to he. Like I said, I think that's like a 70s, 80s sort of like, I don't think anyone would agree to that now.
Well, here's what I'll say is that when I was in college 6 years ago, we weren't told to default to he, but the assumption was that we would. So like all papers that are examples we were given always defaulted. And I would actually disagree that I think a lot of these craft books always default to he.
I don't think so. Not the ones I've read.
I feel like a lot of the ones we've read, actually, there was like one or two where they defaulted to she, and it really stood out to me because all the other ones always refer to the writer or the main character in a book as he.
I would go as far as to say too, so many of us here on AuthorTube also default to he, I think, to the point where I sometimes, when there are some people who default to she, and I always just delight in it their whole video long. I'm always just like, as they're always using she.
I was actually really shocked when some of them did use she because so many of them use he, the craft books that we've read. So like, I think that especially like when they're talking about the writer or the main character of your book, they always use he. I don't know. It's always the men. Always the men use he. Almost every single time.
That I would agree with, that almost always men default to he. What I have seen more so, and I have I'm just gonna say, like, I've read more craft books than you this year. I would say that the majority of them, what's actually a little jarring to me, is that I've seen a lot of them oscillate back and forth, and then it confuses me because it's like if you refer to the writer as a he in the last chapter, and now in this chapter it's a she, it's like so noticeable to me that you did it. But I feel like a lot of them purposefully, I have seen default to she purposefully, because so often he is the default. But I can only speak to, like, in terms, because she's talking about writing teachers, and so I can only speak to, like, my experience. But I went to graduate school in the 2000s, like, was learning how to do this, and had college. Like, what I'm saying is it depends on who your instructor is and when they went to school and what things were in fashion. And so that's why I'm saying, if you're going to say that this is updated to the 21st century, it's only people who weren't in school and weren't teaching or learning to be a teacher in the 21st century that are still using that. So, like, 21st century education, 21st century composition theory, and education courses are not teaching people to default to he. They're not doing it. Like, that's not a thing anymore. So yes, if you have old teachers, if you have boomers as teachers, which I know a lot of us still do, or people that are maybe like, 80 or 80s or 90s, that might be the case.
Here's what I'll say is, like, so I was in college like 6 years ago, and the people were your age, but I also went to college in Southern Illinois. So that could play a factor in
100%. That does also affect.
Because, like, yeah, they were like around your age, but, like, again, area really depends.
It depends on who's teaching them, right? So, like, my composition theory teacher was very young. He was in his 30s. So he was not, he was very on the, like, our composition department in particular was all young people. And then the rest of the department was really old. So, but, like, the composition, so, like, it depends on, like, again, like, when they went to school and who's teaching them. But I was just thinking, like, when she's saying people do that, because my experience is different, because I have learned to be a teacher in the 21st century, we are not being taught to do that anymore to students. So that is, luckily, the good thing is that is on its way out. A lot of the advice that she said the teachers do, new teachers coming in are not continuing on with those antiquated ways of thinking about writing and composition and things like that. And I would say, since we're just talking about this, I think that this could be a helpful book, not just for writing fiction, but also just for writing, because it does talk about sentence variety, syntax, grammar and punctuation, and understanding voice and tense and things like that. So, like, even if you're just like, maybe if you write essays or, things like that, if you have a blog, I think it could be helpful just in some of the tips in that as well.
I agree that I think this is a good writing book just in general, not necessarily just creative writing.
Yeah. So, but I do think it was interesting she didn't think it was for beginners, because I would very much disagree with that. Yeah, I do like when they, like, I guess the oscillating back and forth is, like, a good compromise. It's it's boring to me.
We read one, I think, for this book club that did that, and I just was like, why can't they just use they? They, to me, would be so much easier to read than switching back and forth.
Yes, and that's honestly how most people speak anyway. How we speak, we automatically do sort of gender inclusive and just say they. Like, most people do not say he or she or default to he when they don't know. Like, if I found a cell phone on the ground, I wouldn't be like, I wonder if he, knows he dropped his phone. Like, I would not default to assume that it was a man as the default pronoun. I would say, I wonder if they know they dropped their phone. Like, we always sort of, I think that's more common in speaking to just default to they. And I do think that because language is always evolving, and I think that will be what's going to be put in textbooks, sooner rather than later. Although, unfortunately, Texas controls a lot of what happens in textbooks. So we got to get Texas on board here, but yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
That's true. Lizelle said people do that a lot with dogs still, though. They assume.
Oh my God, I can't tell you though, you guys. Everyone assumes Falcor before they know his name, although they don't know the name. A lot of people don't know the name anyway. They always assume he's a girl. It's so weird to me. I would never. I don't know. It's like a weird thing. It's like, and I don't like. They're always like, "Oh, she's so cute." And I'm like, okay, I know his little wee wee is small, but he still has like, it's so weird. Like, Thank God.
I think when it comes to like small cute dogs, people assume small cute dogs are girls for some reason.
Yeah, I think they always think Khaleesi's a boy too. It's just so weird. Like I don't think I ever assumed gender on a dog. I'm always just like, oh, they're so cute. You know, like
my dog has kind of a masculine name, Charlie, so everyone assumes that she's a boy. But
yeah,
you've never seen Charles in Charge?
Yeah. Okay, let's see if there was anything else. Were there other things that you guys thought to want to talk about? I think we covered a lot of it.
Just that above all of this, I still was charmed by some things that Le Guin said. I still laugh that she thought the things that she covered in this book were sexy. I don't think she was joking when she said she was covering the sexy parts of writing.
Yeah.
I think that was serious. So I just can't imagine anyone thinking of her as anti-Ursula. Like she seems very, like I imagine her and Joyce Carol Oates as the same person almost, just like very serious and not intense even maybe, you know, who like never blinks and knows everything.
So I know it's so funny. Like, so my friend who like, you know, knows her, my friend also does science fiction and her parents are science fiction professors in Idaho. So it's like they're all a little like quirky, weird sci-fi people, you know? So it's like, I can't imagine though, but I have met Joyce Carol Oates and she is very that in person. She's very like,
she gives that just in the commercial for her master class. She's just like, I'm Joyce Carol Oates and I'm partially frozen.
Yes, 100%. Like very, it's a little like off-putting, honestly. I mean, she like I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I never met Ursula Guin. I don't know what she's like, but I just know that my friend Stina, she just was like, you know, she didn't realize till much later, like when she was in college, that like, oh, and Ursula is kind of a big deal, you know. So I just thought that was so funny. I was like, oh my God, it's crazy. Something I liked that she talks about is where she's talking about story versus plot. The page on page 122, where she says, I define story as a narrative of events, external or psychological, that moves through time or implies the passage of time and that involves change. And I define plot as a form of story that uses action as its mode, usually in the form of conflict, and that closely and intricately connects one act to another, usually through a causal chain ending in a climax. So this is what we were talking about earlier, where she was saying that stories don't always have to have plot, but this is like her specific definition of plot, right? And so I like that, even though I think most stories now have to have that kind of plot, and I think most craft books are teaching to that you have to have the conflict with causal change ending in a climax. But I still liked her definition of story, what makes a story, as thinking about just narrative events that move through time and involves change. But that is Good.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I'm also, in thinking about that podcast again, where she was talking about this book, she also did discuss the way that she has a strong aversion to the idea that all stories are conflict centered. But it's because her definition of conflict is different. For instance, you know, she thinks a story about, learning to apologize to someone maybe is that the apology isn't a conflict. She just seems to have a very tight and narrow definition of what conflict can be. Whereas when I was off put by that, because I think I see almost everything as conflict in story, not necessarily as like the mountain you have to climb, but the thing that is moving you from this scene to the next is still conflict to me. So
yeah, and that's why I like that she emphasizes, so that we understand what she means when she's saying that not all story has to have. Though it's because she's thinking about it very specifically, and what she considers conflict. And I think that's really important, because sometimes we can misread craft if we don't understand. Because I was just reading Hooked, and he refers to like inciting incident, and the way he's using inciting incident is different than like how other craft books define an inciting incident. So it's like really important that you understand like what they mean. And yeah, like I would disagree that like some stories don't have conflict, because that is something that a lot of craft books are, that they vary in how they define conflict, and also scene. So like one of the books I read said that like conflict has to involve two people. And I just don't think that's true. Like I think conflict can be with yourself or with like an idea or like a concept. You know what I'm saying? Like so I just think it's interesting like to hear other people's definition of like what things mean. But yeah, so she says conflict is one kind of behavior and there are others equally important in human life. But I think it also goes to like, so there's a big movement in composition theory where they say everything is an argument, right? Like everything you say, everything you do is an argument. And that, I think that's where she doesn't like that idea, that everything is a conflict, everything is an argument, but it's all about framing how you're thinking about things. And I would say that arguably now the way publishing works and writing works, that is expected. A conflict like that, they want to know, what is the conflict? Like agents want to know in your query, what's the conflict? What's the issue? Like,
Nope.
You can't get away from, that is, and that's even for literary fiction, because we, like Kevin and I know people who are published in literary fiction, and like that is still expected regardless of where you're trying to publish or what you're trying to, it's the 21st century. People, there are different expectations of that. So yeah, so any like other thoughts about this, or just kind of craft in general? Like I know that a lot of us have been, for this book club, we've been learning a lot about craft, or like things that we think have really I've learned so much this year from this book and other books for sure. But I don't know, what about you guys?
There are some ups and downs this year, that's for sure.
Yeah. I definitely feel like I have a much better understanding of structure, of how to structure a novel and pacing from reading craft books. And that is something that I really struggled with before, because my only reference was literary fiction. That's the majority of how I learned with writing and reading as well. And literary fiction for sure does not have those same kinds of structures and pacing. And because I don't write literary fiction, then I really needed to learn how that works otherwise. So I'm also curious too, what you guys still feel like I could ask you two, Kevin and Edward, like what are some like craft things that you feel like you still need to learn more about, or to like deep dive into?
For me personally, because I'm really hoping the Witch book sells. I would really like to read a craft book that focuses on like how to write a series or just a sequel that builds off the first one but has its own story. Does that make sense? Like I want one that like actually explains how you can write especially like okay. Remember when trilogies were really big and the middle one's always a bog? And
yeah.
Very well. Like I would like a craft book that really explains how you can do this well. Because I've never really written a sequel before, and I'm really nervous to do it.
Yeah,
on sequels.
Is it Sarah Cannon that has a series on how to write on her YouTube channel on how to write series, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Have you been watching those?
Yes. I've been watching them slowly. I haven't watched all of them yet because I haven't actually finished this book yet. So like I feel like things might change still.
Yeah.
But again, at the same time, it's like I don't know, if this book doesn't sell, then I don't need to worry about that right now. But I need to keep it in mind. But I would like a book that talks more about sequels.
Yeah.
For me, when it comes to craft books, honestly, I enjoy reading craft books just in general, but I mostly enjoy feeling connected to the author who wrote them.
Yeah.
So really, I'm not necessarily looking for anything specific in my craft books. It's just when I find a writer who I respect or who does something that I enjoy, I always like to just kind of see how they're making it work. But one of the earliest things that was impressed to me when I was in my undergraduate program still, and that I actually feel so grateful for, is that like craft books are, well, my professor literally saw them as more dangerous than helpful, actually, and that as much as somebody would like to pretend that it is, writing is not concrete or set. Like, there are many ways to write, and there's what works for 99 people won't work for the 100th person, and that 100th person might sell a book. So it's just like, when I'm reading craft books, that's always something in the front of my mind. Even when I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, that's so impressive, I'm like, it'll never work for me. So, I'm not afraid to just literally be like, oh, Ursula K Le Guin, you published 40 books. This advice is garbage. Even though I don't feel that way mostly about a lot of this advice.
Right. No, I think that's a really great point. And I think that goes with learning any kind of art, is that like, it's really about learning other people's perspective and other people's ways of doing things, and then pulling from that what does work for you and what does help you. So like, just because a book doesn't work for me doesn't mean it wouldn't work for somebody else. And that's why when I do like review them, I'm always like giving my opinion and then saying who I think it could work for and what could be helpful for it. And I like every book, even the books that I've loved, not everything in the book I loved, like there was just like, and usually the books that I love are because there's something about the way they explain something, even though I may have heard that advice 4 other times, the way they explained it clicked for me in a way that other ways of explaining it didn't. And that's something that I appreciate about craft books, is not because I feel like someone's giving me something nuanced that I've never heard, but it's like, okay, did they say it in a way that helped me think about it differently so that I can apply it? And just, it's more about accumulating tools for your toolbox, and not all those tools are going to work for every job, right? But you have them and they're there that you can pull from when you may or may not need them. And yeah, you're right. Like, it depends on the person and what they need also. And yeah, you don't have to, it's art. So there's no book that's going to tell you this is how to do it. It's all just people's opinions. It's all people's experiences. But I think that there's something to be gleaned. That's why I like the book club, because even if I didn't like a book, it doesn't mean I didn't get something from it. There may have been one thing in it that I got from it. And I never feel like I'm losing something by reading craft books. It's never taking away from my ability, right? It's only either enhancing what I already know or adding to what I have. And so that's what I really like about it. And someone asked
Carolyn
what I've read this year. My favorite one that I've read all year is Story Genius. Now, part of it, of course I love Save the Cat, but I read that last year. So, so if you're going to ask me my favorite for the year, it's Story Genius. 110% would recommend to every single person. And I know
alone about it.
Now, I know not every single person likes it because people have told me they don't like it, but I would still recommend it to everyone because that's how much I like it, that I would just say, everyone try it, because I think it was that helpful. So yeah, so that would be my number one. Kevin, what about you? Of all the ones you've read this year, what would you?
I'm like looking at my stack. Oh my God, come back to me. Let me think.
Come back to you. What about you? I don't know how many you've read this year, Edward, but what are some craft books that 100% you would recommend, or like a number one that you would recommend?
Well, this year, the craft book that helped me the most, I would say, is Saves the Cat. As I kind of got my wheels rolling on AuthorTube here, I seen everybody talking about it, so I went out and got a copy, and it has really helped me kind of see the way with plotting a little bit more, and also too having kind of using their structure, but then also kind of changing some things for myself has been so helpful.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I actually haven't read as many craft writing books as I would like this year. So yeah, I guess Saves the Cat would be my number one this year.
Yeah, if you were to ask me, my most is these two. I think that these two, and I do think that people have some issues with this, and I think that their critiques are valid. But for me, I really struggled with plotting structure, and this was just invaluable to me in terms of how to structure things. And then I like Story Genius to fill in the gaps of what Save the Cat didn't fill in for me. So that's fun. Kevin, do you finally have an answer for us?
So I looked at my ratings because, like, honestly, none of them really stood out to me that much this year. I'm not gonna lie. Like, they all had their, their things, but like none of them really stood out. My favorite was probably How to Write a Damn Good Thriller. No, I'm kidding. That book. No, I actually really liked Writing Deep Scenes. I mean, when I say really like, I liked it. I would recommend it, but I honestly don't really have a favorite. I'm reading this next, and the thing is, like, me and Laura have very similar tastes in a lot of things, so I have a feeling I'll really like this one. So maybe it'll end up being this one. I don't know. Watch me hate it. Watch me just hate this book. Me and Laura do have.
You want to be contrarian. You want to just.
I do really love Save the Cat, right? The novel, but again, I didn't read it this year. But this is probably the one I recommend the most to people.
Yeah. I would say my top three, and I'm probably going to do like a video more on this like later, but my top three, of course, Save the Cat. Number 2 would be Story Genius, and then number 3 would be Writing Deep Scenes.
Yeah, Writing Deep Scenes was probably my favorite we read this year.
Yeah, for the book club, I would say Writing Deep Scenes was my favorite.
What, this one, Laura?
Yeah. That's a no for me, dog. Okay, that's a no. But it's not my least favorite of the year. My least favorite of the year was How to Write a Damn Good Thriller. Thanks a lot.
The one I go back to,
all the ones that I highly recommend are linked in the description. I have a list of like writing craft books I recommend or that I use, and those are all down there. So
this is the one I come back to the most, which is why it's like in the worst shape, because this is the one I actually go back to read through. Like when I started writing my adult book, I was trying to figure out which one she classifies it as so I can get a better idea. So this is definitely the one I recommend the most, go back to the most. But again, yeah, I also see how it's not for everyone.
Yeah. I'm in the process of creating a plotting Bible where I'm taking all the notes from the craft books I've read and putting them into like a thing that I'm going to use to plot books moving forward. And those 3 books that I just recommend are the books I'm using. And then the 4th one that I'm using is Hooked.
I want to read that one too.
So I'm actually going to be posting my review of Hooked tomorrow on my channel. So
really quick, Alexis said, "I'm sorry, please invite me to read an actually good one next year." And for a second I was like, "You suggested it," and then she said, "Don't let me suggest one."
Yeah. I already have a couple of book choices. Like I think I already know the January and the March book for next year. I'll tell you, one of them came up in our last book chat, which is Scenes and Sequels, because I had never heard of that concept of scenes and sequels before, and then it came up in Hooked, and it came up in one of the other ones. Was it Writing?
Yeah, it keeps coming up, and I had never.
Yeah, and so I'm really intrigued by this concept, and I want to know more. And I honestly kind of wish I would have read it before I do my rewrite, but that's okay. We'll do it for next year. But it's not going to be the first choice because we already have the first choice. But anyway, that's just a little sneak preview of next year. So, oh, that's right, Evie, you did. Yeah, I really want to read that because now I'm intrigued by that idea. Yeah, so I'm going to be showing too on my channel the plot Bible and how I'm kind of setting that up. So make sure you subscribe. Okay,
so,
but anyway.
This only pertains to me. But earlier, Beatrix asked me how my witch edits are going, and they're going. I have a video coming out soon about it, so make sure you hit that subscribe button on my channel.
This is the moment where we all do shameless plug. Edward, everyone's they're living for your plan aesthetic. We love it.
Yeah, I just sit in front of them and take credit for them all the time.
Moon's favorite was Writing Mysteries. Oh, edited by Sue Grafton. Never heard of that. I'm gonna write that down. Yeah. Does anyone else have any suggestions of like really good craft books you read this year? What your favorites were? Because I'm here for them.
I cannot recommend it as being good because I haven't read it yet, but I've had this for 2 years, and every year I tell myself that I make everything fall from my shelves. I'm going to read On Writing Horror.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I had a professor actually, because I took a science fiction workshop course, and he recommended this.
Who's it by?
Yeah.
It's edited by Mort Castle.
Love the name.
Yeah,
Love
it sounds like someone who would. But
Right.
it's mostly just it's a collection of craft essays from a bunch of writers. So
Ooh,
the
I
first one's our favorite, Joyce Carol Oates.
Yeah.
But then Stephen King.
Stephen McKing.
Yeah,
That's my pen name, actually. So you caught me. But yeah, just basically it's just a bunch of craft essays, and then it like breaks them into sections, and then at the end, Mort Castle has some exercises that he recommends you do.
nice.
So.
Because I actually have a horror that I want to write soon. I have many books I want to write soon, but that one right now is in my because I'm very much in a horror mood. So I would love to read that for sure. And I like the idea that it's a collection from other people rather than one person.
Alexis said that she's always wanted to read On Writing by Stephen King. I would say it's a memoir that sometimes talks about his writing.
Yeah.
It's not a super...
I read half of it, and I didn't get to anything that had to do with writing yet.
Yeah, I didn't think it was very profound, but...
I liked it because I like reading about writers, but I don't think it was necessarily like a craft book like this.
That's what I would say, and this is kind of like a spoiler to like what my reviews will be for master classes. And I was actually thinking, I was going to ask you, Edward, have you taken any master classes?
No, I did just sign up for $1 though, but I haven't.
Right.
I've just been so busy with everything that I open it up and then just close it.
Because if you like just like hearing from writers that you admire, that's what I think master classes are good for. Because they're not giving you deep dives like story geniuses on how to write, but it's rather than just like they're masters of the field, and these are just like some general tips and advice and things they've learned. What I loved about one of the things I love about Margaret Atwood is she was like referring to things she did to write like The Handmaid's Tale, and she was like pulling out her papers, and like the academic in me, I was like, oh my god, it's Margaret Atwood's papers, like it's her notes and like newspaper clippings, and like she used to do everything by hand, and it was just like, so it's just cool to like see someone you admire and you like talking about something that you love so much yourself, so I would highly recommend them for that. And yeah, it was $1 for people who had a student email address. So
turn me off.
Let's see, what other book did I see? Oh yes, Moon mentioned Francesca Lia Block's The Thorn Necklace. I've been wanting to read that because I'm upset. I love Francesca Lia Block. I love everything she writes, so I haven't read that yet. So.
Have you read Bird by Anne Lamott? I feel like that's another one that's really popular in college creative writing.
Yeah, that one has been recommended to me, but I have not.
I'm sorry, I'll be right back. I'm really sorry.
I haven't read it either.
You haven't read that, and then I think I saw Alexa say Sue Grafton book was recommended. The Sue Grafton one. Okay, that's the one that Moon said about mysteries. Yeah, because I definitely for the book club next year want to do. I'm always up for suggestions on like what kinds of things people want to learn. Like, do you guys want to learn about like how to write horror? Like we tried to do the fantasy fiction formula, didn't really talk about learning fantasy. Tried to do one on writing thrillers, how to write a damn good thriller. Wasn't really much about how to write a damn good thriller. So far, I'm like 0 for 2 on trying to find genre specific books. So if anyone has any recommendations that they think are actually good, I'm definitely here for those, because I've read so many now that are just general about writing that I'd love to get into specifics next year on. The one that we're reading in January is specific to young adult and middle grade writing. So that I like. And then, like I said, like I want to check out the horror one and stuff like that. So I'm here for all those for sure.
Someone suggested earlier in the comments that we should find a craft book written from a feminist perspective.
Ooh,
that too. But when I did a quick Google and nothing came up, but I wasn't like searching, because here I was.
Feminist perspective. Yeah, that's a good. I'm trying to think. I mean, I know some like in terms of like writing in general, but not necessarily. I don't know any about fiction writing.
Yeah.
Bell Hooks, I think, is a really good person for general writing, but
all we really need to do is look up this publisher because they do a lot of them.
Who, Story Geniuses?
Yeah, 10 Speed Press did both Save the Cat Writes novel and Story Genius.
There was one in one of the master classes, I think, that was like, it was in Hook. He was like, if I only recommend one book, it's this book. And I was like, okay, that's pretty high praise. So maybe I should see what that's all about. But it was published by a Writer's Digest, a published one. So I was like, I don't know. Writing business books as well, if you wanted to switch it up. Oh, yeah.
Another good craft book that isn't really in fiction, but that I see recommended all the time is Story by Robert McKee. It has to do with screenwriting, but it's a great book. It's actually probably the first craft book I ever read.
That's actually one that has been recommended to me quite a bit. So, because I'm also here, like, I feel like if I'm going to be, because that's just how I kind of approach everything. Anything that I want to be like a master in the field or something that I feel like I want to know what the classics are. I want to, it's like I'm a huge horror enthusiast, right? Like I'm obsessed with horror movies. So I can't say I'm obsessed with horror movies and never watch Freddy Krueger movies, right? Like you have to know them, even if you don't love them. So I feel like any book that like people highly recommend and is recommended a lot, I'm going to read it because I feel like if I want to say that I know writing craft, I got to read all the ones that are really highly recommended or recommended a lot. So that one has been recommended to me a lot. I definitely want to read that one. So any like particular things that you guys are hoping to learn more for next year? I feel like for me, I would like to do more on, like I said, genre specific advice, like horror, like mystery, like thriller. I also have been on the lookout for books that specifically give advice about writing for young adults and for children. Because a lot of the advice, that's why I really liked writing Deep Scenes, because one of the examples was a young adult contemporary. It was, The Fault in Our Stars. Because a lot of times the advice doesn't always apply the same if you're writing young adult or if you're writing middle grade. So I would like to see one that is talking specifically about writing for young adults or writing for children. So yeah, in the horror, I have horror to recommend. The
Magic Words is about writing YA.
What one is?
It's called The Magic Words. Alexa said I blanked on the name, but she was a Scholastic editor.
Yes, I think that's the one that we're planning to read for January.
It says, the warning, it'll use Harry Potter a lot as an example because she.
Oh god, I hate that. But I actually think that I have to look it up because I have it written down. But I think that's the one we're planning to read for January. Is Magic Words. So yeah, so that's kind of what I'm hoping to focus on next year is looking at specific to genre and audience because I think that makes a big difference. And then also I'm still really sucky at like transitions. Like if I'm trying to I would love something that really try to help you because I really liked Hook, the book Hook, because it's really focused on just the beginnings of books. So it'd be nice if there was some books that are just focused on one aspect. So endings of books, or I'm really bad at transitioning and passing of time. How do you do that? So kind of those kind of specific things in writing rather than general.
Sorry, I need to step away for just 1 second too.
Oh, sure. Definitely no requirements during this book club. This is just something that I pick a book. We all read it and then talk about it on the date. You don't even have to read it to come to the chat if you just want to hear what we think about it. And we really tend to just talk generally about writing craft. So 100% no, just bring yourself, watch the video. I always make a video on what book we're reading, who the guest host is. It's always me and Kevin, and then we always have a guest host. In the future, we might have more than one guest host. I'm definitely open to that as well. And I'm always open to book suggestions, but we are going to do it every 2 months just to because some people have to get the books from a library or something, and that could take a while. So I want to give everyone an opportunity. I do have an Instagram for the book club. It is in the description as well. And I haven't gotten I was going to show you guys, but I haven't gotten it in the mail yet. I have cute little stickers for the book club as well, is linked in the description for those too. Judy Blume. I'm going to be taking the Judy Blume masterclass eventually. Yes, it does focus on kidlit. So I've taken I'm going to be writing reviews for the Neil Gaiman, and I took Margaret Atwood. Those are the only ones I'm taking this year, because then now I'm going to be focusing on my rewrite. But then I plan to take more in the next coming months. And Judy Blume is definitely one of them. Yes, we are going to. Alexa, I want Alexa back on for sure. Yeah, definitely the more. I just wanted to test it out this year with only having one, just because I know that I talk a lot. I want everyone else to have an opportunity. I'm like one of those nervous talkers where it's like if there's even like a half a second of silence, I'm just going to start filling it with. So it's usually best to just start talking over me, and then I'll shut up because I'm weird with silence. So,
God.
Hush, Jessica. You know what though? When I don't talk a lot, when I'm on live streams when there's a lot of people, I specifically try not to, and then people call me out. They're like, "Why aren't you talking, Laura? Why aren't you saying anything? Why are you being so quiet?" Like, try not to be rude. Lizelle said, "I would love something that helps with mood and atmosphere." Yes, I would love that as well.
Yeah, same. Agreed.
Yeah, so let's all be on the hunt for some, and I really want some ones that are like newer. Like I'm all here for the classics, for like the ones that everyone recommends and has read, but I definitely would love to see some new stuff.
For something that it doesn't specifically deal with mood and atmosphere, but I took a creative nonfiction course where we read the book A Natural History of the Senses by Diane Ackerman, and I do think that it's all about writing nonfiction, but about interpreting the world around you in like a beautiful way through your senses. And it is something I think that has helped me a lot with kind of writing atmosphere outside of
right.
And so
Ooh.
That's something I would recommend.
Awesome. I feel like I maybe have heard of that before. It sounds familiar. I might have been. Yeah, I think I've heard of that. Like, because my area in graduate school was trauma studies, and I feel like that was a recommended book. Now that I think about it, in terms of like understanding the body and senses and things like that.
Moon wants to know what the title was.
It's A Natural History of the Senses by Diane Ackerman.
Yeah, Jessica, when there's a lot of people, especially when it's people that like, when it's not like my channel and there's a lot of people, I try to like be quiet.
Thank you for coming, Lizelle. Have fun running away.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Lizelle. Yeah, I definitely agree that like reading true crime is helpful for like there's definitely books that are like there are things you can do outside of reading craft books that help with writing for sure.
Agreed.
Hans Zimmer's class when he spoke about characters and tone. Okay. I'll write that down. All right, guys. Well, any parting thoughts before we go here? I think we're reaching the end. Like overall, like I said, I mean, I'll give like a full review on my channel probably I think next week. But yeah, I definitely think that I enjoyed just reading Ursula Le Guin's thoughts on writing and her advice, more so than like, and I think the adjustments for 21st century just threw me off and it made me read it in a different. If she hadn't said that, then I might have just been reading it. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of old advice. But then it's just like the 21st century guide. Now you're just wrong. Like it doesn't feel very 21st century. But overall, I didn't hate it, and it's definitely a quick read for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the easier ones to read.
And I still think it has it could be really helpful too for foundational or for writers who need to find kind of a foundation, and also too for maybe a group of writers who are trying to put together a critique group of some sort but really don't even know where to start. I do think this would be a good book to kind of cover together to get everyone on the same page, to just kind of freshen up everyone's vocabulary or get you used to some of the vocabulary that you'll hear a lot in workshops.
Yes.
But as I said too, I do think one of the important things is that maybe most of this information you will outgrow.
Yeah. But I think that's true, and I think that you're right, then that it is foundational, in that all things are foundational. All things that are foundational, you eventually outgrow, like you learn and go beyond that. And it's something we didn't really talk about, but I did want to emphasize that she does have a whole appendix on the peer group workshop and how to set those up and how to participate in those. So I think that's really helpful for what you were saying too. We're getting a lot of good suggestions here that I'm going to look into. The emotional craft of fiction, I've heard. Yeah, I think I've heard that one too. Yes, that's another one, Jessica, I will say. Susan Dennard has if you sign up for her newsletter, but it's also on her website, she gives really great writing advice. I have not read any of Susan Dennard's books, but I subscribe to her newsletter because it has really good writing advice in it.
Better be careful saying you haven't read any of those in front of Jessica.
I know, right? But yeah, so this was a good chat, and this has been a fun year of learning craft and talking to people and hearing other people's, perspectives on things. And like I said, more than anything, I just think it's really important that I feel personally as writers that we're always trying to learn and grow and take in new information. And I don't think we're ever in a position to where we don't need to learn something. Because when you stop learning, you stop growing, right? So that's the teacher in me telling you to always be learning. It doesn't hurt anything, right? It never takes away from your ability to write or to be productive or anything like that. So, but yeah, so I have enjoyed everyone coming in and joining in the chat, and enjoyed having you today, Edward.
Thank you.
Hopefully in the future we can do some more together. And yeah, thanks guys. If you need any information on the book or their channels or any other things I mentioned in the video, it's all down in the description, so you can check that stuff out. So, all right, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Awkward goodbye, because then I have to hit end broadcast and it takes some time.